She was 56 years old, and after 33 years of marriage, she had exactly $211 to her name. No house anymore, no car that was fully hers, no plan beyond the front seat of a borrowed station wagon and a cardboard box of things her husband's lawyer had decided she was allowed to keep. And with a single dollar bill, plus $42 in county recording fees, she bought an abandoned telephone of exchange at the end of a gravel road in the sandhills of north-central Nebraska, in a township so small the state had stopped maintaining the sign on the highway in 1991. The roof over the equipment room had a hole in it the size of a wagon wheel. The front windows had been covered with plywood for the better part of 2 decades. The county said the building had been dark since 2009 and was scheduled to be knocked down and hauled off that coming May. But what nobody knew, not the county, not the man who would later drive 400 miles to try to take it from her, was that beneath the floorboards of the old switchboard room, inside a compartment that had not been opened in more than 40 years, was something that would change the rest of her life. Before we go any further, if quiet stories like this one mean something to you, take a second to subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. We love seeing how far these stories travel down the line. Della Knoll came from people who had spent their whole lives keeping the wires up. Her grandmother, Ruth Knoll, had been a telephone operator at the Cordell Exchange in Brown County from 1928 until the cooperative cut over to dial service in 1955, 27 years on a cord board, plugging and unplugging brass-tipped patch cords 10,000 times a day until the smooth brass of the plug at her own position number 3, had worn down soft as a river stone. Ruth had said, "Number, please," so many times in her life that she said it in her sleep. She had kept that one brass plug when they decommissioned her board, slipped it into her apron pocket on the last morning, and carried it the rest of her days the way some people carry a wedding ring. Della's father, Walt Knoll, had grown up under that board, doing his homework on the floor of the Centlos office in Cordell, while his mother put through the calls of an entire county. He took the wires into his own hands the only way a man could in that country. He went to work for the Rural Electric and Telephone Cooperative as a lineman in 1956, and he spent the next 22 years climbing poles in weather that would keep a sensible man inside, stringing copper and aluminum across a land so empty that a single line could be the only thing connecting a ranch family to a doctor 60 miles away. He told his daughter that a line was a promise. He told her that the whole point of a wire was that someone, somewhere, could pick up a receiver in the worst hour of their life and reach a voice that would answer. He told her that the job was not climbing poles. The job was making sure no one was ever truly alone out there. He died on an ice-glazed night in January of 1978, when Della was 17, restoring a line that had gone down in a blizzard north of Ainsworth, because 3 ranch houses on that circuit had no other way to call for help, and a baby on one of them was running a fever of 104. He got the line back up. He fell from the pole afterward, on the way down, when his climbing gaff slipped on a rung sheathed in 3/8 of an inch of clear ice. The county sheriff, who came to the door, said the family on the circuit had reached the doctor in time, and the baby had lived, and Della had held on to that one fact for 40 years, like a coin she could not bring herself to spend. The line had been up. Someone had been able to call. Walt left behind a wife who would follow him within a decade, a daughter of 17, and almost nothing else, because a lineman's wages in 1978 did not stretch past the grave. The only thing of value that came to Della was Ruth's brass plug, the worn cord tip from position number 3, which her grandmother had pressed into her hand the year before she died and told her to keep, because, she said, a Knoll girl ought to always have a way to know that the line was open. Della put it on a leather cord around her neck the week of her father's funeral, and she had worn it every day for the next 4 decades, boss. It tapped against her collarbone when she walked. She thought of it as her grandmother still saying, "Somewhere."
"Number, please."
Della married Glenn Mercer in the spring of 1983, 3 weeks after she turned 22. He was a tall, easy-talking man who had just taken over his father's farm implement dealership in a town in the eastern part of the state, and for a long time, Della believed she had married a man who understood the difference between a thing's price and a thing's worth. She kept the books for the dealership for 33 years. She raised 2 children who grew up and moved to Lincoln and Denver and called on Sundays. She nursed Glenn's mother through her last 4 years of dementia in their own spare bedroom, changing sheets at 3 in the morning, and learning to answer to the name of a woman who had died in 1961 because the old woman had no one else, and Della could not stand the thought of a person facing the end with no familiar voice in the room. There was a particular Sunday she would think about later, in the cold of the Buick, because it had seemed at the time like the smallest things, and had turned out to be the whole shape of her marriage in miniature. It was the autumn of 1997, and Glenn's mother had wandered out of the house in her nightgown at 4 in the morning and gotten 3/4 of a mile down the county road before Della found her, barefoot in a hard frost, convinced she was late for a church choir that had disbanded in 1971. Della had walked her home with her own coat around the old woman's shoulders, and her own bare feet going numb on the gravel. And she had sat up the rest of that night, holding a woman who called her by a dead sister's name. And in the morning Glenn had come down for breakfast, stepped over the coat still drying by the door, and asked whether there was any sausage. He had not been cruel. That was the thing Della could never make anyone understand. He had simply lived his whole life on the assumption that someone would always be there to handle the night, and had never once wondered who, or at what cost, because the cost had never appeared on any statement he was responsible for reading. She had been the night he never had to handle. For 33 years she had been the line that was always up, and a man does not thank the line. He only notices it the one time it goes down. She did all of it quietly, the way her grandmother had said, "Number, please," the way her father had climbed the poles, without ever once expecting that the doing of it would have to be repaid. That was the trouble, in the end. She had spent her whole life believing that the keeping of promises was its own kind of currency, and that a life lived as a steady, answering presence would naturally accumulate a balance somewhere that could be drawn on when she finally needed it. She found out at 56 that the world did not keep that kind of ledger, or that if it did, it was kept somewhere she could not reach. Glenn left her on a Tuesday in September of 2016. He had met a younger woman, a regional sales representative for a seed company, at a trade show in Kansas City 11 months earlier, and he had been keeping 2 lives running on parallel circuits ever since. He came home that Tuesday, set his coffee mug in the sink, and told Della across the kitchen island that he had filed papers and that she would be hearing from a lawyer named Boyd. He said it the way a man reads a weather report. The dealership was in his name. The house was in his name and his mother's trust. The land was in his name. Della had spent 33 years keeping the books of a business that, on paper, she did not own a single bolt of. The divorce was final the week before Christmas. After the lawyers were paid and a second mortgage Glenn had quietly taken out was settled out of what the court called the marital estate, Della's share of 3 decades came to a check for $4,118 and a 2003 Buick station wagon with 211,000 miles on it that Glenn said she could have because the trade-in value wasn't worth the paperwork. By the 3rd week of January, she had spent most of the $4,118 on a deposit and 2 months' rent on a room that fell through, a transmission repair that did not hold, and a stretch of motel nights after. By the 1st of February, she was sleeping in the Buick in the parking lot of a truck stop off Highway 20. With the box of her things in the back seat and the brass plug cold against her collarbone and $211 left in a checking account she was afraid to look at. If you've ever lost the thing you built your whole life around and found out it was never in your name, stay with me. Because the part of this story that matters most is still coming. She did not fall apart exactly. She had buried a father at 17 and a mother at 26 and Glenn's mother at 54, and she had learned that grief was a kind of weather you stood inside of and waited out, not a thing you argued with. But she was tired in a way that had no bottom to it, and on a gray morning in early February, she walked into a cafe and motel in the small town of Mummelin in the heart of the Sandhills, mostly because the sign out front said the coffee was $1, and she had $1. The woman behind the counter was named Lorna Pruett. She was somewhere past 60, built solid as a fence post, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and the unhurried watchfulness of a person who had spent 40 years learning to read strangers the moment they came through a door. She ran the Sandhill Cafe and the 6 cabins behind it that called themselves a motel, and she had buried one husband and outlasted a second, and she poured Della's $1 coffee and then, without being asked, set down a plate of eggs and hash browns and did not put it on the ticket. Della looked at the plate. She looked at Lorna. She started to say she couldn't, and Lorna said, You can settle up when you're settled up," and walked away to wipe down a table that did not need wiping, which Della understood after a moment was a kindness wearing the costume of indifference so that she would not have to thank anyone for it. She ate the eggs. She did not cry because crying in a cafe was a private weather happening in the wrong place. But it was the first warm thing that had happened to her in 5 months, and she felt the warmth of it travel down through her like current. Finding a ground. She stayed in Mullen because she had nowhere else the gas would reach. Lorna let her have cabin 4 for $11 a night, which was less than half the rate, and after the second week, she stopped charging entirely on the unspoken arrangement that Della would work the breakfast shift, which Della would have done for nothing because it gave her hands something honest to do. She bussed tables and ran the register and learned the names of the ranchers who came in at 5:30 before the light. And in the evenings she sat in the empty cafe with the old desktop computer Lorna kept for guests, and she tried to imagine a version of the rest of her life that she could afford. An apartment anywhere was out of reach on no wages. She was 56 with a high school diploma, 3 decades of bookkeeping for a business that would give her no reference, and a credit history attached to a man who had already let 2 accounts go to collections in her name. One evening, more out of the dull need to be looking at something than out of any real hope, she typed cheapest property Nebraska into the search box, the way a person presses on a bruise to see if it still hurts. The 4th result was a county surplus page from a place called Wend County, a sparse, sandy stretch of grass and blowouts west of where she sat. The county was selling off, for nominal sums ahead of a scheduled demolition, a short list of abandoned public and utility buildings it had taken for back taxes and could no longer justify insuring. A consolidated rural schoolhouse, a grain inspection shed, a former creamery, and near the bottom of the list a single line that made Della set her coffee down. Former Larkin Mutual Telephone Co. Central office, town of Larkin, vacant since 2009, structure unsound, scheduled for demolition this spring. Minimum bid $1, a telephone exchange. A central office. The kind of building her grandmother had spent 27 years inside, the kind of building her father had strung the wires home to. Della sat very still and read the line 3 times, and the brass plug at her collarbone seemed, for the first time in a long time, to be tapping out something other than grief. She showed the listing to Lorna the next morning over the grill. Lorna read it twice through her reading glasses, then looked up with an expression Della had not seen on her before. "Larkin," Lorna said. "There's nothing left of Larkin but the church and the cemetery and that little brick exchange. But I'll tell you what, honey. My mother lived on the Larkin lines when I was a girl, and the woman who ran that board, Opal Renner, was the closest thing to a guardian angel that country ever had. People out here didn't say call the doctor. They said tell Opal. You ask anybody over 70 in 3 counties, and they'll have a story about Opal Renner at the Larkin exchange." Lorna paused and her voice changed. "She kept the line open. That's what we said. Opal kept the line open." Della touched the plug through her shirt. "I think I'm going to go look at it," she said. "I think you are," Lorna said. "Take the wagon. I'll cover the morning." The Wend County Courthouse was in the town of Drummond, an hour and 40 minutes northwest of Mullen on roads that ran arrow straight between fence slicing for 20 slant stretch, the grass of the sandhills, going from tan to gold to a kind of bruised violet as the light moved over it, the only sound the wind and the gravel and the meadowlarks. Della had grown up in this country and had forgotten how it pressed in on a person, not with crowding but with the opposite. With a bigness so total it made you understand exactly how much a single voice on a single wire could have meant out here. The county clerk's office was a single room on the courthouse's first floor, and behind the counter sat a woman in her late 50s named Hazel Bittner, who had been the clerk of Wend County for 22 years, and who looked at Della over the top of a ledger the way a person looks at someone they have been half expecting. "You hear about the Larkin exchange," Hazel said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. You know it's been empty since '09. Roof's bad. No power, no water that runs, the well pumps seized. County set to take it down the 2nd week of May." Hazel set down her pen. "I'll be honest with you, because I'd want somebody to be honest with me. There is no good financial reason on God's earth to buy that building. The land it sits on isn't worth the gravel road that gets you there. I have $1, Della said, and I'd like to buy it before May." Hazel looked at her for a long moment, the way Lorna had looked at her over the eggs, the way the whole of this country seemed to look at a person who said a true thing plainly. Then she reached under the counter and brought up a deed book that had clearly been sitting ready, and Tedit Page had been bent that waiting, it seemed, for years. Sign here and here and here. Della signed Della Ruth Knoll, her maiden name, in the careful upright hand her grandmother had taught her at a kitchen table 45 years before. Hazel took the $1 bill and the $42 in fees that Della counted out in worn bills and quarters, and she stamped the deed with a heavy stamp that made a soft, flat thump against the page. "It's yours," Hazel said. She slid a brass key across the counter. "And for whatever it's worth, Della Knoll, I think Opal would be glad it was somebody who'd sign her grandmother's name." Della looked up sharply, and Hazel only smiled and turned back to her ledger, and Della understood that in a county this size, everyone already knew everything and had simply been waiting to see what she would do with it. If you're still with me, do me a favor and subscribe, because what Della found inside that building 3 days later is the reason this story exists at all. The town of Larkin was 9 miles south of the courthouse, and then 4 miles down a county road that the map still claimed was maintained, and the wheel beneath Della's hands knew was a lie. There was a white frame church with a closed door, a small cemetery on a rise behind it surrounded by a leaning iron fence, the stone foundation of a store that had burned at some point past anyone's memory, and at the end of the road, in a clearing where the grass had been allowed to come back, the central office of the Larkin Mutual Telephone Company. It was a small, sturdy building of dark red brick, not much bigger than a 2-car garage, with a low-pitched roof, single brick chimney, and a small projecting bay at the front where a wide window had once let the operator watch the road. The plywood over that bay window had gone gray and soft. A wooden sign above the door, the paint mostly weathered away, still carried the ghost of letters, Larkin Mutual Tel. CO. The poles that had once carried the lines out from the building stood here and there along the road behind her, leaning, stripped of their crossarms, the wire long since salvaged for scrap. The whole place had the particular silence of a building that had once been the loudest, busiest, most necessary room for 40 miles, and now heard nothing but wind in the grass. Della stood in the clearing for a while before she went in. The wind came off the grass, smelling of dust and sage and the dry sweetness of cured bluestem, and somewhere a meadowlark ran up its long liquid scale, and the brass plug tapped against her collarbone. And she thought about her grandmother and her father and a baby with a fever of 104 who had lived because the line had been up. Then she put the key in the lock, and the old tumblers turned with a reluctant grind, and she pushed open the door of the Larkin Exchange and stepped inside. The front room was a single space with a worn plank floor, plaster walls gone to the color of weak tea, and a cold cast-iron stove in the corner with its pipe still running up through the ceiling. Along the back wall, beneath a film of 3 decades of dust, stood the thing the whole building had been built around. The switchboard, a tall oak cord board, the kind they called a magneto board, easily 7 feet long and 5 high. Its face a grid of small brass-rimmed holes called jacks, hundreds of them, each one a line out to a ranch or a house or a barn across the empty country. Below the jacks ran the rows of cords, dozens of black fabric-covered patch cords with their brass plugs, the operator's tools for joining one line to another, for making out of 2 separate silences a conversation. A long wooden operator's bench ran the length of it, with a single high-backed chair pushed in, and a headset on a hook, and a writing shelf worn pale where a woman's forearms had rested for 35 years. Della walked the length of the board slowly. She put her hand on the cold iron of the stove. She put her hand on the back of the operator's chair. She picked up the headset, the old kind, a single earpiece on a metal band, and a heavy transmitter on a breastplate, and she held it the way she had seen her grandmother hold one in a photograph, and the leather cord around her neck swung forward, and the brass plug knocked against the brass plugs on the board with a small bright sound, metal recognizing metal, and Della stood very still in the dust and the slanting afternoon light and felt, absurdly, completely, like she had finally come home to a house she had never once set foot in. She sat down in the operator's chair. She looked out through the gap in the plywood at the empty road, and she thought about how her grandmother had sat in a chair exactly like this one, in a building exactly like this one, saying, "Number," please, to a county full of strangers who were not, in any way that mattered, strangers at all. She slid the chair back to look at the floor beneath the bench, the way a bookkeeper looks for the discrepancy she knows is there. The floorboards under the operator's position were the same old pine as the rest, but the three boards directly beneath the bench were a slightly different shade than those around them, darker, oiled at some point, and aged separately. Della knelt down and ran her fingertips along the seam where the dark boards met the light. There was a gap. A deliberate gap, cut clean and square, the kind of gap that does not happen by accident in a 40-year-old floor. She found a flat iron bar in the corner that might once have been part of the stove's grate, and she came back and worked the end of it under the edge of the dark boards, and they came up together as a single hinged section, perhaps 18 inches square, swinging on a pair of leather hinges that had hardened with the years, but had not, after all that time, given way. Underneath, fitted neatly between the floor joists, was a shallow wooden compartment, and inside the compartment, resting on a folded square of waxed canvas, were four things. A heavy tin box with a hinged lid, a thick envelope, the paper gone the color of weak coffee, the ink faded to brown. A small American flag, folded in the tight triangular military fold, the field of stars showing 48, and a brass telegraph key on a wooden base, the kind a Navy radioman would have learned his trade on, worn smooth where a thumb and two fingers had tapped out 10,000 words in dots and dashes. Della lifted them out one at a time and set them on the operator's bench. Her hands were not quite steady. The envelope was addressed in a careful, upright hand, the lettering of a person who had spent a lifetime writing other people's names and numbers neatly enough to read in the dark. To whoever keeps the line after me. She opened the tin box first. Inside, in tidy bundles held with paper bands gone brittle and brown, was money. Old currency, the larger bills they printed before 1929, and the smaller ones after, mostly 20s and 50s, a few hundreds. All of it, the savings of a woman who had drawn an operator's wage for 35 years, and a small pension after, and who had clearly never once trusted a bank with it. Della counted slowly, twice, sitting on the floor of the exchange in the failing light. The total came to $61,840. Beneath the money, wrapped in a man's clean white handkerchief, was a set of Navy dog tags stamped with the name TB Eats A, and a small black and white photograph of a young man in a sailor's uniform, grinning at the camera with one eyebrow raised, and on the back, in the same careful hand, the words "My Lou, USS Hammond, 1942. Then she opened the envelope. The letter was several pages of the same coffee-colored paper, written in brown ink that had faded but never blurred, and Della read it slowly, in the last of the light through the broken plywood, with the wind moving in the grass outside, and the brass plug cold at her throat. To whoever keeps the line after me. My name is Opal Renner, and I have been the operator at the Larkin Mutual Exchange since the autumn of 1939. I am writing this in the winter of 1974, the week they are coming to take the board out and put in the automatic equipment. After which the company has agreed to sell me this building for $1, so that I might live out my years in the only place that has ever truly felt like mine. I do not know who will read this, or when, or whether the building will still be standing. But I have learned, sitting at this board for 35 years, that a line is a kind of promise made into the dark, and a promise does not stop being a promise simply because you cannot see who is on the other end. So I am making this one to you. I came to Larkin in 1939, 21 years old, and engaged to be married to a young man named Louis Tibbets, who had joined the Navy that spring and who I expected would come home to me. He did not. His ship went down at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, and the radioman who sent the last signal from her was a friend of his, and Lou had taught that boy his Morse on the very key you have found beneath this floor, which Lou gave me before he shipped out so that I would, he said, always have a way to send for him. I never married. I do not say this for pity. I say it so that you understand that I had no one to go home to, and that the people on these lines became, over the years, the only family I was given. When you sit where I have sat, and you hear a county breathing on the other end of the cords, you stop being able to tell where you end, and they begin. I have written down, in the ledger you will find with this money, every night that the line mattered more than my own sleep. I did not keep it out of pride. I kept it because I came to believe that the small things a person does in the dark, when no one is watching and no one will ever thank them, are the only things that turn out, in the end, to have been real. The money is for you. I have no children, no one of my blood who ever came to see what I did out here or cared to. I would rather it went to whoever is willing to sit in this chair and keep the line open for the people who have no one else, than to anyone who shares my name. The flag is from Lou's mother, who outlived him by 30 years and folded it herself. The key is Lou's, and through him it is the county's, because every emergency I ever relayed, I relayed on the trade he taught a friend who died. Keep it on the board. If you are reading this, you came to Larkin after I was gone. Maybe you came because you had nowhere else to go. Maybe you came because something in you needed a quiet place to begin again. Whatever brought you down that road, I want you to know that this exchange has been waiting. An exchange is a patient thing. Its whole purpose is to connect what is separated. And a thing like that does not stop wanting its purpose simply because the equipment has gone quiet. I have been the one waiting at Larkin since 1939. I am putting the call through to you now. Pick up. Keep the line open. Be kind to the people who have no one else, because there are more of them out here than anyone driving past would ever guess. And when your time comes to leave this chair, leave it the way I am leaving it for you. With the line still open. Opal Renner, Chief Operator, Larkin Mutual Telephone Company, the 14th of December 1974. Della read the letter twice. Then she folded it back along its old soft creases and sat very still on the floor of the exchange with the money and the dog tags and the brass key and the small folded flag in her lap and the dark coming down outside over the grass. And she did not cry, because she had her grandmother's restraint and her father's hands and a lifetime of standing inside weather and waiting it out. But she said aloud, into the empty room, to the woman who had sat in that chair for 35 years, and to whoever else might be listening on the long dark lines of the world, I hear you, Opal. I'll keep it open. I promise. If this story is reaching you somewhere quiet tonight, take a moment to subscribe, and tell us in the comments about a person in your own life who kept the line open for you when you had no one else. We read everyone. The ledger was in the bottom of the compartment, wrapped in oilcloth, a hardbound accounts book that Opal had turned to a private purpose. Della read it over the following week, by lantern light in the cabin in Mullen, a few pages a night, the way you eat a thing you don't want to finish. It was not, in the end, an accounting of money. It was an accounting of nights. January 11, 1949, Della read. Blizzard. Roads gone since noon. Emmett Sturtevant rang in at 9, thrown by his horse out by the corrals and dragged, two-rib stove in and bleeding, alone at the home place, his wife away at her sister's in Valentine. Could not raise Dr. Pullman, lying down past the river. Stayed on with Emmett the whole night, kept him talking so he would not slip under, read him the seed catalog and the obituaries and finally the entire book of Ruth from my own Bible, until I raised the doctor at dawn on a borrowed circuit. Emmett lived. He named his next calf after me, which he thought was funny, and which it was. There were 400 pages of it, spanning 35 years. A boy with a snake bite north of the river kept calm on the line while his father drove. A woman in labor whose baby came too fast talked through it by Opal until the doctor's car made it out. A house fire on the Valesek place. The whole party line rung at once at 3 in the morning, so the neighbors came with shovels and a water wagon and saved the barn. A man named Curtis Vogel, a lineman like Della's own father, kept on the line one whole night in 1961 after his wife had died because the entry said simply he could not bear to be in the house with the silence and I could not bear to let him. One entry stopped Della cold and she read it 4 times. January 14, 1978. Ice storm 3 counties over. Word came down the wire that a lineman had gone off a pole near Ainsworth in the dark restoring a circuit so a sick child could reach a doctor after he had already gotten the line back up. They saved the child, they lost the man. His little girl is 17. I did not know him, but I have known 100 men like him, and tonight I rang every house on the Larkin lines and asked them all to leave a lamp burning in a window for a man none of us ever met who died keeping a promise made out of copper. It is the only thing I know how to do for the dead. Light the windows. Della sat with the ledger open in her lap in the lantern light of cabin 4 and understood that she was reading, in a stranger's hand, the night her own father died. Opal Renner had mourned Walt Knoll in 1978 without ever knowing his name, had asked a whole county she had never told to light its windows for him. Della was 17 when it happened. She was 56 when she finally learned that someone, somewhere on a copper wire, had grieved. There were nights in the ledger that did not end well. Not many, but a few, and Opal had written those down too, in the same unflinching hand, unsoftened, because she had believed that you do not get to keep only the nights that ended well. Della did not start exactly with a plan. She started with the roof, because Opal's letter said be kind to the building, and a building with a hole in it cannot be kind back. She spent 10 of the 35 days she had before the demolition crew was due learning how to lay asphalt shingle from a video on Lorna's computer and from an old rancher's offhand advice, and she made every mistake there was to make and corrected most of them. She did not touch Opal's money carelessly. She moved most of it into a credit union in Drummond after a long talk with Hazel Bittner about the legal niceties of money found in a building one owns, and she spent it out in small, careful amounts. A bundle of shingles, a keg of nails, used hand pump for the seized well, which, when she got it working, gave up cold clear water that tasted of iron and sand and tasted, she thought, like the truest thing she had drunk in a year. A camp stove, a cot, a wool blanket, a propane lamp, work gloves that fit her own hands. She learned to caulk a window and to reglaze the bay where the plywood came off, learned to clean a chimney flue and to coax the cast iron stove back to life so that the front room of the exchange held heat through the cold spring nights. The roof nearly beat her. She had it 3/4 shingled on a Thursday in late March, when a wind came up off the grass with the particular sustained meanness the sandhills can produce in spring, 40 miles an hour and gusting higher, and it caught the bundle of shingles she had left stacked at the ridge and peeled 6 courses of her 2 days' work off the south slope like a man peeling the lid from a tin. She stood in the clearing in the failing light and looked at the bare sheathing showing again, and the shingles scattered across 40 feet of dead grass, and she sat down right there on a sawhorse and put her cracked hands over her face, and for about 90 seconds she let herself believe she could not do this. Then she thought of Opal's letter. An exchange is a patient thing, and she thought of her father going up a pole into the ice because 3 houses had no other way to call, and she got up off the sawhorse and gathered every shingle she could find in the dark by feel. And she was back on the roof at first light with a longer nailing pattern and a humility about wind she had not had the day before. It held. It was still holding 2 winters later. She had learned the thing every honest trade teaches eventually, which is that you do not get to do the work only on the days the weather agrees with you. She slept on the cot beside the stove and woke before the light and worked until she could not see, and her hands, which had spent 33 years totaling columns and turning the pages of a business that was never hers, blistered and cracked, and then went hard and capable in a way that felt, after the first painful week, like a debt finally being paid down. The people of Wend County began to notice. Word travels in a country that empty the way water travels through sand, quietly and completely, and within 2 weeks of Della signing the deed, everyone over the age of 50 within 40 miles knew that a woman had bought the Larkin exchange and meant to keep it from the wrecking crew. The first to come was an old man in a battered Ford, who got out slow and stood in the clearing a long while before he spoke. He was 91 years old, and his name was Emmett Sturdivant. "They tell me," he said, "that a Knoll girl bought Opal's exchange." Della came out wiping her hands on a rag and said that she had. The old man looked at the brick building for a while, and at the leaning poles, and at last he said, "A horse put me down out here in January of 1949 in a blizzard, and I was 23 years old and bleeding and 40 miles from the nearest doctor, and there was a woman on the other end of a copper wire who would not let me go under. She read me the Bible till the sun came up." He stopped. His chin worked. "I'm 91 years old. I outlived my wife and one of my sons, and I have wanted for a long time to come back out here and say thank you to that building, and there was never anybody here to let me in." Della opened the door. She made him coffee on the camp stove. He sat in the operator's chair because she asked him to, and he put one trembling hand flat on the writing shelf where Opal's forearms had worn the wood pail, and he stayed an hour, and when he left he gripped Della's hand in both of his and said, "You keep it open now. You hear me?" And Della said that she would. After Emmett, they came steadily. Hazel Bittner drove out from the courthouse on a Wednesday with a thermos and a box of records she thought Della should have. A retired cooperative lineman named Curtis Vogel, the same Curtis from the Ledger, now 84, came out and stood in front of the board and wept without apology, and then spent Spatu Saturdays helping Della rewire the building for a small propane generator, and showing her, with hands that still knew, how the old board had worked. A woman named Verna Pullman, daughter of the Dr. Opal, had spent 1,000 nights trying to raise on failing lines, brought a casserole and a cardboard box of her father's papers, in which, she said, Opal Renner's name appeared more often than any nurse's. People brought things and left them, the way people always do for a place that asks nothing of them. A jar of chokecherry jelly, a cord of split wood stacked by the door, overnight by someone who never said who, a hand-lettered card that read only, "Thank you for Opal." A heavy-set man of about 70 named Dale Velsek drove 2 hours from the eastern part of the county one Saturday and would not come inside at first, just stood by his truck, turning his cap in his hands. When Della came out, he told her, not quite meeting her eyes, that he had been 9 years old the night that Shinomi's family's barn caught fire in 1957, and that the reason there was still a Velsek ranch for him to inherit, the reason he had a place to raise his own kids and bury his own folks, was that a woman at a switchboard had rung every house on the party line at once at 3 in the morning and turned 11 neighbors out of their beds with shovels, hence cotton fields a mere prude before the fire could reach the house. Oas. "I'm 70 years old," Dale said, "and that woman has been dead near a decade, and I never once told her." He had brought, wrapped in a feed sack, the old hand-crank wall telephone from that very house, the one his mother had used to call the exchange that night. He set it on the bench inside without a word and drove the 2 hours home. It hangs on the wall of the Larkin Exchange now, where Della can see it from the operator's chair. Lorna drove up from Mullen in the 3rd week, with the back of her truck loaded with things from cabin 4, and a few of her own, besides, a real mattress, a set of curtains she had sewn from a bolt of yellow cloth, a framed photograph she had found, of the original Larkin operators, standing in front of the building in 1941, with a young, dark-haired, fierce-eyed Opal Renner in the center of the row. Lorna stayed 3 days. She slept on a cot in the equipment room. She helped Della paint the front room a soft cream that doubled the light, and on the morning she left, she stood by her truck in the clearing and said, "Your grandmother kept the line open in Cordell. Your father died keeping it open in a blizzard, and now here you are." She put her hand on Della's cheek, rough palm and all. "You're a knoll in the only way that ever mattered." Then she drove back toward Mullen, and Della sat down on the doorstep of the exchange and for the first time since a Tuesday in September the year before, let herself cry, fully and finally, the way you cry when you finally understand you are no longer falling. By April, the roof was tight and the windows held glass, and the stove drew clean and the well ran. Della had a home, the first one in her life that no one could put her name on a box and take away. She had begun in the evenings to do a small thing without entirely deciding to. She had Curtis help her get a single working telephone line, run out to the exchange from the modern cooperative 2 miles off, the only line that came to Larkin anymore, and in the mornings before the light, she made a pot of coffee on the stove, and she sat in Opal's chair, and she called the 4 oldest, most isolated ranch households in that end of the county, one after another, just to hear them answer and to let them hear a voice. Emmett Sturdivant, a blind widow named Idella Crane. A pair of brothers in their 80s who had not left their place in 2 winters. She did not call about anything. She called the way Opal had served coffee to brakemen who were not on her route, the way her father had climbed a pole in the ice. She called so that no one out there would wake into a silence with no voice in it. And then, on a bright cold morning in the last week of April, 11 days before the demolition crew that Della had not yet managed to officially cancel was due, a black SUV she did not recognize came down the 4 miles of county road and stopped in the clearing, and a man in a good gray suit got out and looked at the brick exchange the way a person looks at a thing he has already decided he owns. Before we go on, if you've made it this far, I want you to know the next part is the reason Opal kept everything she kept beneath that floor. Subscribe and stay with me. His name was Royce Renner, and he was Opal's great-nephew, the grandson of a brother she had outlived by 40 years and mentioned in her letter only as anyone who shares my name. He was 58, and he explained, with the patient warmth of a man who has found that patient warmth opens doors that bluntness does not, a land and right-of-way broker out of Omaha. He had, he said, only just learned through family channels that his great-aunt's old building had come up in the county records, and he had driven all this way because he felt, as the only surviving blood relation, a certain responsibility. He smiled when he said blood relation. Della, who had spent 33 years reading the faces of men trying to sell or buy farm equipment, watched the smile and felt the cold come into the clearing the way it comes off a north wall. He came inside when she did not invite him to. He looked at the painted walls and the working stove and the board with the headset back on its hook, and Della watched him pricing it, watched him doing the arithmetic of a man for whom every object in a room is either an asset or an obstacle. He admired the restoration. He said it was a shame, really, sentimental old buildings like this. He said he assumed she'd put real money into it and that he hated to be the one to bring her difficult news, but that there appeared to be, in his words, a cloud on her title. The county sale, he said, had been improper. Opal had died intestate without a will in 2009, and the building should have passed to her heirs at law, of whom he was now the only one, rather than reverting to the county for taxes. He had spoken with an attorney. He was prepared, he said, to be reasonable. He would reimburse Della her costs, generously, and take the building off her hands, and they could avoid the unpleasantness and expense of a quiet title action that, he said, with another patient smile, a woman in her situation would surely rather not face. He did not say how he knew her situation. He did not need to. What he did not say, because he did not think she could possibly know it, was the rest. Della learned it later, partly from Hazel, and partly from the obvious shape of the thing. A regional wireless carrier was building out a chain of towers across the sandhills along the Highway 2 corridor, and the parcel the Larkin Exchange sat on, with its existing utility easement and its line of sight down 2 long valleys, was worth far more as a leased tower site than anyone would ever pay for a brick room full of dead copper. Royce Renner had a signed option in his briefcase to broker that lease, contingent on clear title. He did not want the exchange. He had never once, in 58 years, driven the 4 miles down that road to see his great-aunt while she was alive. He wanted the ground it stood on, scraped clean, and a steel tower where the building was, and a commission that would run Hazel Guest into 6 figures. He had heard, somewhere down the family channels, a rumor that the old woman had kept money in the building, which had brought him faster than the land alone would have. He had not found that rumor hard to believe. He simply had not understood, could not have understood, what the building was actually worth, because he was a man who had spent his life confusing the 2 kinds of value, and had never once been forced to learn the difference. Della did not tell him about the money. She did not tell him about the ledger or the letter or the dog tags or the flag. She said, in a voice she kept as level as a spirit bubble, that she believed her title was good, that she had bought the building lawfully from the county, and that she did not intend to sell it for any sum, and she stood in the doorway of Opal's exchange, and let the wind come through behind her and did not move until he left. He left smiling. He said he understood, that emotions ran high, that he'd have his attorney be in touch, and the SUV went back up the 4 miles of gravel, and Della stood in the clearing a long time afterward with the brass plug cold at her throat, and her father's voice in her head saying, "A line is a promise," and her grandmother's voice saying, "Number. Please!" And she understood, with the clarity that comes over a person at the exact moment they decide they will not be moved, that Opal Renner had not hidden a tin box under the floor of a building. She had hidden a reason for the next person to fight. The letter that came from Royce's attorney, a man named Boyd Hessler, was 4 pages and contained the word litigation 11 times. It asserted that the Wayne County tax foreclosure had failed to properly notify Opal's heirs, that the sale was therefore void, that his sole surviving heir, Royce Renner, held superior title, and that Della was, in the meantime, occupying his client's property without right. It demanded she vacate. It offered, in the same breath, to make it all go away for what it called a goodwill payment in exchange for a quitclaim. It was Della Saw, a document built entirely on the assumption that the recipient would be too poor, too tired, and too alone to do anything but take the money and go. Boyd Hessler had read her situation exactly as Royce had. They were not wrong about the poor or the tired. They were wrong about the alone, because Della did not face it alone. She drove to Drummond and put the letter on Hazel's Bittner's counter, and Hazel read it once, took off her reading glasses, and said a word Della had not expected to hear from a county clerk. Then she said, "Honey, I have been the clerk of this county for 22 years, and I filed every page of that foreclosure myself, and I would like nothing in this world better than to bury this man in his own paperwork." And she went to her cabinets and began pulling files. What the records showed, laid out on Hazel's counter over 2 long afternoons, was this: Opal Renner had not died intestate, with the building passing untouched to distant heirs. Opal had owned the building free and clear since the cooperative sold it to her for $1 in 1975, and she had in 1976 executed and recorded with the very county a deed and a short witness declaration of her intent, naming the building and stating in plain language that, upon her death, it should pass to the township for the benefit of the people on the old Larkin lines. and that the township could not maintain it. It should go to whatever person would keep it standing and keep it open. The township, as it happened, had dissolved in 2004. So when Opal died in 2009 with property taxes unpaid because there was no longer a township to forgive them, and no heir who had ever bothered to pay them, the county had followed the law exactly. It had mailed notice of the delinquency and the impending foreclosure to the last known address of every person of record, including Hazel, showed her a certified letter sent in 2011 to one Royce Renner of Omaha, Nebraska, signed for by a member of his household and ignored. The statutory redemption period in Nebraska on a tax sale was 3 years. Royce Renner had received actual, certified, signed for notice that the building could be redeemed by paying the back taxes, a sum that had stood in 2011 at $1,847.16, and he had let it pass without lifting a finger, because in 2011 a brick room at the end of a dead road in Wend County had been worth, to a man like Royce, exactly nothing. The redemption period had expired in 2014. The county had taken clear title. The county had sold that clear title to Della for $1. Royce's claim that the sale was improper for failure to notify, the heirs collapsed on a single certified mail receipt with his own household's signature on it, dated 3 years before the deadline he claimed he was never told about. And there was the recorded declaration, Opal's own words, filed with the county in 1976, stating in her careful upright hand that she wanted the building to go to whoever would keep it open, and not to anyone who shared her name. A judge would never even need to reach the question of whose blood was whose. Opal had answered it 41 years in advance. Hazel made certified copies of everything. Della took them to a legal aid attorney in Drummond, a young woman who did the whole thing for the cost of the filing fees once she had read Opal's letter, and they answered Boyd Hessler's 4 pages with 11, attaching the certified mail receipt, the recorded 1976 declaration, the foreclosure record, and the clean tax deed. The answer made one additional point, quietly, in a single sentence near the end. It noted that should the matter proceed, the defendant intended to introduce into the public record the full ledger maintained by the decedent, Opal Renner, documenting 35 years of emergency assistance rendered to the residents of Wend County, as evidence of the decedent's clearly expressed and recorded intent regarding the disposition of the. It was a small sentence. It meant that if Royce Renner wanted to fight, he would have to do it in a courtroom in Drummond, in front of a judge and a county clerk, and very likely a gallery full of the descendants of every person Opal had ever talked through a blizzard, while a lawyer read aloud, page by page, the record of what his great-aunt had done with the life he had never once driven 4 miles to witness. Royce Renner did not fight. The case was dismissed at his own request in early June, with prejudice, which meant he could never bring it again. The wireless carrier, Della heard later, put its tower on a hilltop 11 miles east, on land owned by a rancher who was glad of the lease money and who waved at Della every time he passed her road. Royce went back to Omaha. He had spent, by Hazel's estimate, more on Boyd Hessler's letters than the redemption would ever have cost him, and he came away with nothing, because he had spent his whole life believing that the value of a thing was the number you could get for it, and he had run, finally, into a building whose worth could not be expressed in any number at all, defended by a woman who had learned the difference the hard way, and a county that had known it all along. His failure was not bad luck. It was the failure of a man who had never understood what he was looking at. If this is landing somewhere in you tonight, take a moment to subscribe, because the last thing Della did with what Opal left her is the part I most wanted to tell you. Della had Opal's $61,840, which the law now confirmed was hers, found in a building she lawfully owned. She had thought about it a great deal during the weeks Royce was threatening to take everything. She decided about it the day the case was dismissed. She did not keep it for herself, or not much of it. She used a small part to finish the building properly, to put in a real wood stove and a propane generator that could carry a few lights and a refrigerator, and most of all, a bank of telephone equipment. And she used the rest to start a thing that the county had not had since the lines went automatic in 1974, which was a person whose entire job was to make sure no one out there was alone. She called it Larkin Central, because Opal's letter had told her to keep the line open, and she could not think of a better name for keeping it. She set up a single published telephone number, the old Larkin exchange number that Curtis Vogel helped her reactivate, and she let it be known through Hazel and Lorna and Verna Pullman and the church bulletins of 3 counties that anyone in that emptiness who was old or alone or sick or simply could not stand the silence of a house at 3 in the morning could call that number and a real voice would answer. She kept Opal's ledger going. Not the same book, a new one, but the same purpose, in the same upright hand her grandmother had taught her. The entries began to fill in. A widower on the Crane Road who called every evening at 9 just to say goodnight to a human being. A diabetic rancher 30 miles out whose blood sugar Della learned to talk him through when his hands shook too hard to test it. A young mother, new to the country and frightened by its size, who called the first winter night a blizzard closed her road, the way another young mother had called Opal in 1951, and whom Della kept on the line, reading her the seed catalog and the obituaries. And finally, when she ran out of other things, the book Daru Tromer's Maribel, until the dawn came up and clean over the grass and the woman's husband made it home. Della named no calf after herself, but she did, the next spring, plant a row of lilacs along the south wall of the exchange, because Opal's ledger had mentioned on a single line in 1953 that she missed the lilacs from her mother's yard, and a person ought to have lilacs. By the second year, there were 31 people on her mourning list, and Lorna had recruited 2 other women in Mullen and a retired nurse in Drummond to split the calling so that no one ever went unanswered, which meant the thing Della had started by herself in an empty brick room quad quietly become a web of voices stretched across 3 counties. The same web that had hung from willingness of a few people to pick up a telephone. Rebuilt out of nothing but the willingness of a few people to pick up telephone. There was a man named Royal Petch, 88, on the far western edge of it, who had not spoken more than a sentence to anyone in years, and who answered Della's call every single morning with the same gruff, "Still here." For 14 months it was still here, and nothing else. And then one March morning, the phone rang and rang on the Petch place and no one answered, and Della called the sheriff's office in Drummond and a deputy drove the 33 miles out and found Royal had passed in his sleep in the night peacefully, an old man alone in a vast country. Della drove out for the funeral. 11 people came. She learned there, from a cousin that Royal Petch had told the man at the feed store the autumn before that the only reason he'd kept getting up in the mornings at all was that he knew the phone was going to ring at 6, and a woman was going to make sure he was still here. Della had thought she was making a courtesy call. She had been the thing keeping a man alive, and she had not even known it, which is, she understood exactly how Opal had done it for 35 years, and exactly why Opal had written every night of it down. She kept the coffee on. Hikers found the Larkin Road eventually, and birders and the occasional lost traveler off Highway 2, and railroad and telephone history enthusiasts who had heard there was a working magneto board in a brick building in the middle of nowhere, run by a woman who would let you sit in the operator's chairs and put through a make-believe call to no one. She charged none of them. They left things, the way people always do for a place that asks nothing of them. A jar of honey, a loaf of bread, a folded bill in a tin on the bench. By the second autumn, the Larkin Exchange had become a thing it had not been since 1974, which was a place people went on purpose, down 4 miles of bad gravel, to be reminded that they could be reached. On a clear evening in late October, 2 years after she had signed her grandmother's name in a courthouse with her last dollars, Della Knoll sat in Opal's chair in front of the old board with 2 plugs in her hands. One was her grandmother's, the worn cord tip from position number 3 at the Cordell Exchange, that had hung at her own throat for 40 years. The other she had taken from Opal's position at the Larkin board, the plug Opal Renner's own hand had worked smooth across 35 years of saying number, please. Della held them up in the last of the light, and then, on a private impulse she would never have been able to explain to anyone, she joined them, plug to plug, the 2 brass tips touching, 2 dead circuits completing each other into a closed loop that ran nowhere and connected nothing and meant, to her, everything. 2 women, 1 chair repeated, 1 promise kept and handed down. She thought about her grandmother Ruth, who had said, number please 10,000 times a day for 27 years, and who had pressed a Morse pluck into a 16-year-old girl's hand, and told her a Knoll girl ought always to have a way to know the line was open. She thought about her father Walt, who had climbed a pole into 3/8 of an inch of ice to put a line back up so that a baby with a fever could reach a doctor, and who had fallen on the way down with the line already singing back to life above him. She thought about Opal Renner, who had buried her own marriage at the bottom of the Pacific in 1942 and had spent the next 35 years marrying herself instead to a county full of strangers on a copper wire, and who had hidden a tin box and a letter and a folded flag beneath the floor in 1974 because she had believed correctly does not stop being a promise simply because you can't see who is on the other promise, because you cannot see who is on the other end. And she thought about Glenn, who had let her go because keeping her would have required him to understand that 33 years of someone answering when you called it a thing with a value, and who had never once in his life been able to read a balance sheet that did not have a dollar sign on it. Della understood now that Glenn had not meant to send her here. Glenn had only meant to make his own life simpler. But sometimes the lines other people cut are the lines that send our call rerouting through to the one place that was waiting to pick up. And sometimes a cold front seat in a truck stop parking lot is the same thing as a ringing on a magneto board at 3 a.m, a signal coming in from somewhere out in the dark, asking only that someone, anyone, be there to answer it. That is the thing about an exchange. An exchange does not stop being an exchange just because the calls have stopped coming. It keeps the circuit in its bones. It keeps the cords coiled and the jacks bright and the chair pulled up to the board. It keeps the tin box under the floor and the flag folded in its triangle and the worn brass plug ready in the operator's hand. All the small honest things the last person who loved the building set down before they turned the key in the door. An exchange waits. Its whole purpose is to connect what is separated, and a thing built for that purpose does not stop wanting it just because the equipment has gone quiet and the town has gone to grass. And when the next person finally comes down the dead gravel road carrying nothing but a cardboard box and $211 and a worn brass plug on a leather cord, the exchange does not need to speak, because exchanges do not speak. It only needs to show her the loose boards beneath the chair. Opal Renner had waited for Della Knoll for 35 years without ever knowing her name. Ruth had waited for her in the shape of a brass cord tip from position number 3. Walt had waited for her in the memory of a line put back up in a blizzard, and a fall that the line never knew about. Lorna Pruett had waited for her with a plate of eggs and a kindness wearing the costume of indifference. Hazel Bittner had waited for her behind a county counter with a deed book already turned to the page. Emmett Sturdivant, 91 years old, had waited 68 years to come back and say thank you to a brick building and had needed someone, finally, to open the door. Della Knoll was 56 years old and divorced and down to her last $211, and she spent one of those dollars on an abandoned telephone exchange at the end of a forgotten road in the Nebraska sandhills. It was the best dollar she ever spent. Every morning before the light, she still makes the calls. She still says, when someone she loves picks up out there in all that grass and dark, the two words that ever needed saying. Number, please. And the line is open. The line is always open now. If this story moved you, share it with someone who has kept the line open for you, or someone who needs to hear that a quiet life of answering when called is never, ever wasted. And if you'd like to go further down this road with us, we have something for the people who truly listen. 12 brand new stories, never posted to YouTube, available only to those who support this channel directly. Each one a full quiet road story, just like this one. You'll find the link below. We made them with our whole hearts, for the people who stay till the end. Thank you for being one of them. We'll keep the line open. See you on the next quiet road.